great to be here for our final episode of our Synoptic series, and today we're going to be doing something special to wrap things up. We've got Dean here who's going to be bringing his thoughts, some of his ideas around the Synoptic series, some of the things we've been touching on. We actually put it out to you listeners to bring forward some questions, and we got one or two through as we continue to engage with our listeners. We like the listeners here, and we've got some questions to think about as we've kind of come out of the Synoptic series, and Dean's going to share some thoughts. I might have something or other to add, but to get us started, we've been spending a lot of time in the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John's been a little on the back burner, and one of our questions is going to take us there a little bit later. But as a starting point, Dean, what do you love about the Gospels, and do you have a favorite Gospel author or moment in the Gospels that really resonates for you?
Boy, favorite moment. I mean, I feel like there are so many. If I was to go, I think there's things that I like about each of the different Gospels. Like, I mean, looking at even the Synoptic Gospels and those three, and obviously through the series, I'm sure you've looked at all the different commonalities and differences. I think I have my favorite things about each. Like, I love Mark for that, just like short, sharp, you feel like you're just punching along from one thing to the next. And so I love, to read Mark in that way, or if I want to read through a gospel in a shorter kind of setting, just kind of grabbing Mark and just reading through the life of Jesus. There's something about that punchiness to it. I love Luke. I don't know why, but I feel like his personality bleeds into it a bit. So sometimes I feel like when reading Luke, you really get this, his detail, and just that kind of, hey, I want to write this orderly, detailed account for you, Theophilus. And so I love that about Luke, as well as I think then there are those moments where, like, I think in Luke, his account of the birth of Christ, that you've got some of those really, you're just classic lines when you think of Christmas and the birth of Christ. And I love Matthew for that same reason, the different aspects of his account of the birth of Christ. So I don't know. I think there's just different pieces that I love about what each of them bring, and the different ways they bring it along.
Yeah, that's great. And in fact, earlier in this series, we touched in specific in those two kind of Christmas accounts between Matthew and Luke, and a lot of great striking images there and what they choose to focus on.
I was a kid on Christmas Eve. My grandma, while she was alive, would always, when we were little, every Christmas Eve, just read the Christmas story. Or my grandfather, while he was alive, at like kind of the Christmas Eve family, gathering. And I just remember, like, I don't know, at whatever point, having this transition, like, oh, you've brought different pieces together, because it's like, a kid getting used to the Bible and going like, where's that? Where is it? It's not all there. Like, and so it is funny how as you grow in your reading of the scriptures, whether it's when you started young or whether you're starting new at an older age, like how they start to come together, and you realize like, oh yeah, there's these different pieces that all complement. I think it's something really cool about the Synoptics.
Yeah, absolutely. And so given, I guess, the emphasis of our series here, we've spent really all of our time on Matthew, Mark, and Luke being our Synoptics. But one of the questions that we've been asked to shed some light on is how the Gospel of John is different, and what we see, and why there isn't that same shared level of content, passages, stories. And there's quite a different, I guess, flair and feel, and really the book itself, it's not the same. So we've just been asked to talk about that a little bit. Do you have any opening observations on John's account?
Well, I think John's account, it is, and I don't remember the exact percentages or whether you covered it, but I mean, it's almost entirely new material versus the other three. And I think it is helpful to realize he's writing for different purpose. You get a sense of it, I think anytime John is like kind of really helpful in one sense, and that he also kind of sums it all up at the end of his gospel. He's like, look, if everything Jesus did got written down, he's like, there's probably not enough room in all the books in the whole world. So I got to choose some stuff. And he says, these things have been written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, and that by believing in him, you might have life in his name. So he tells us, look, this is why I wrote this. So I think you do get this feel from John that he's like, I've got a really clear purpose here, a really clear focus. I'm going to selectively choose things from Jesus' life that are going to be signs, that are going to be recorded for the purpose so that yep, look at this, and I want you to know that Jesus is the Messiah, and you can believe in him and have life in his name. So, and you get, I guess, a different layer of, and you might want to speak to this a little bit, but just the theology of it all. You think about how he starts his account. He starts with, of course, in the beginning was the Word. And so John's going to take us right back to Genesis. Whereas as we talked about, Matthew and Luke in particular, they're going to start with the birth of Jesus, the man, Jesus, fully God, fully man. They're starting with kind of the humanity of Jesus. John is going to start with the divinity of Jesus, and he's going to go, here's right away how this whole thing. I mean, Matthew starts with the genealogy, birth, human, line of Jesus. John just, in the beginning was the Word, and well, okay, I want you to understand this. Jesus is God. This is incredibly rich theologically, and works through in that first chapter, and he came and he dwelt, he tabernacled among us, and he's showing all these allusions to, the Older Testament, to the Hebrew scriptures, to the creation account, even God's tabernacling, being among his people. Hey, this is the Word, the one who created all, has come, has moved in. And then he starts working through those distinct signs, and I believe is it 7, I could have it wrong, but he's got his 7 signs that, he's working through that are all building, just going, this is him. Here's the Messiah. He's come. So I think you just have, in terms of why is it so different, he's definitely just coming at it from a whole other angle. And again, the thing I probably love about John as well is I feel like you feel his personality bleed onto the page a little bit like Luke, or, I mean, they all do to a certain degree, but I feel like you really feel his heartbeat. You really feel like, you just feel this guy who was there, and he was, whereas Luke is documenting eyewitness accounts, you feel John's sense of, when you read it, that this is someone who was there, who's been transformed by it, and that the referring to himself as the disciple Jesus loved. It's so experiential and rich. And I think that's, John's just, to me, it's so different as well, because it feels so personal. That's just my own feeling when I read it, but I just think you feel that personalness in John as well.
That is awesome. I don't know about the rest of you guys, but I hear that and I'm like, man, I've got to get into the Gospel of John, which wasn't what I was expecting with a Synoptic Gospels series, kind of finishing with far out, let's get into the Gospel of John. But I love that. And I love that, you also drew attention to that moment as John's concluding, saying, if everything were written about what Jesus did, there wouldn't be enough space in all the world to contain the books. And like you mentioned, I think that's just such a helpful picture when we consider the Synoptics along with John, the scope of material that these guys are working with and have to choose from as they're forming their account of the life of Jesus. I think that's just a really helpful picture. And as you said, with John's account, so much great stuff there, talking about it's sometimes called the Book of Signs. You reference the 7 signs throughout John, and just really the strength of those theological passages. And one of the sessions we looked at a little bit earlier was the centrality of Christ and the resurrection in all of Scripture. And I think that's something that John really captures, as you mentioned, leading in with those deep central themes of Scripture of who Christ is. So in a lot of ways, I, in my own reading, sometimes see John as a key point of difference from the Synoptics. As you said, the Synoptics really cataloging the life and ministry of Jesus, Matthew and Luke in particular, and then John almost gives us the theological implications for our own life. So it's almost like you could read one of the Synoptics always together with John, because it's kind of like, okay, here's the theology that we take away from this and allow it to build and bring formation in our lives. So I love that. So next thing for me, getting into the Gospel of John's next on my list. So another question that's come up through, obviously, with the Synoptics, we've outlined the similarities, the difference. We talked about the different theories around the sources and how that's come to be. And one of the questions from one of our listeners was just from what do we make of the differences and the similarities that we do see in the Synoptics? And I think for some people it can be seen as a challenge to overcome, but I think it can also be a rich experience to engage with that tension as well. How do you kind of see that, how those differences we see in Scripture here fit together?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, that it's really can be quite a complimentary thing. And I think that is there's people, and you hear all the time, that'll go, oh, totally unreliable because there are conflicts in the accounts and there are different details and there's clear, I'm blanking on the main word people use for this, discrepancies or what, so people will go discount it, write it off. And that's a really common, sort of argument, particularly that happens, I think, when you don't actually just read them all the way through. And so I think the differences are actually, I think, enriching for sure, because they actually are to me, the discrepancies, they're actually a part of what it gives it reliability. I mean, the only time you get one story about anything where every detail lines up is in what we would call propaganda. So you go to North Korea, like the story about everything is going to have a lot of similar. It's going to be, this is the line, do not deviate. Here's the facts, and that's it. Whereas you feel, again, the humanness. So the beauty of all the scriptures is that interplay of God's Spirit working with human beings and what's happening. And that interplay, I think we overstep our mark if we try to dissect it too far. So I think kind of just knowing, like, if they were if people wanted to make something up, this is not how you would have done it. You would have gone, no, here it is, and we're all, don't change it, because then it will look unbelievable. It's like, no, this is very a human touch in all of this. And of recording, again, Luke, here's, I made a plan here. I wanted to put a detailed account together for Theophilus. And so here's what I came up with. And I talked to everybody and I interviewed them. And so I just think all of the differences, they enrich it, obviously, and I'm sure you probably would have talked about this, but it's so important to realize the way they told stories and communicate history so different from how we would. So it is, we make a mistake when we try to go, especially the modern approach, what modernity brought in the Western world, of nothing but the facts, if you will, but versus they're not necessarily trying to do just a factual, they're trying to make a point as well. And they're, as we said before, selecting from a life of material, and choosing things. So all those differences I just look at, to me, they are one of those things that make it more believable. And obviously when you really investigate them and you look at what we're not talking about different, it's not like, if you get three people who all say, here's the car accident happened like this. No, it happened a little bit like this. No, this is what exactly, you're like, well, one thing I'm confident of, there was a car wreck, so I think, I guess here's, I love this saying. I think it might have been C.S. Lewis. I can't remember who, but it's always good to just tribute C.S. Lewis because he pretty much said everything, that guy, But that the Gospels are this thing that you couldn't make up if you would. So, and you wouldn't make up if you could. Like they give it that ring of authenticity. All those things that it's not propaganda. All the details. You wouldn't make the women the witnesses. You wouldn't. That the Messiah would even die, that wouldn't happen. So publicly, you wouldn't make that. All the different things that you're like, it's just not how you would do it. Like if you were going to make something up, which ultimately I think it probably was him who said it, because that was part of what brought him as an atheist to belief and faith, was encountering, wow, like Christ in these Gospels, in the story.
Yeah, I love that picture and those series of pictures you brought there, and even as we get to the end of this series and we're going to wrap here, if you do have any more questions on your mind, feel free to send those through and we'll work a way of answering those. But this has been a fun series and really appreciate you bringing your wisdom, experience to that conversation as well. And I hope for everyone that's been listening along that you've got a new framework to engage with the Gospels. And I think the big takeaway from today is, let's get into the Gospel of John, right? and we're going to continue here at True North Online in some different spaces. So stay tuned and keep following the pod.